It begins with a silence so profound that even the crackle of a candle's flame seems too loud. In the farmhouse of the Whitcomb family, in the heart of Greywick, the night air carried the kind of stillness that presses against the skin, as though the entire world were holding its breath. Gathered in the narrow parlor, the family stood shoulder to shoulder before an object so ordinary it should have inspired no fear, a simple oval mirror, framed in dark wood, set upon the wall. Yet on this night, that mirror would become a thing of terror. One by one, the Whitcombs appeared in its surface. The father, stern and weathered from years in the fields. The mother, her features softened with fatigue. The older sons, restless and uneasy, shifting their weight upon the wooden floorboards. And then, at the end of the line, the youngest, Thomas. His eyes, wide and searching, lifted to meet his own reflection. Only, there was nothing there. The glass shone blank where he should have been. His brothers' faces hovered beside a void, as though the mirror itself refused to acknowledge his existence. At first, no one spoke. Perhaps each believed their eyes had betrayed them. But the longer the silence dragged, the more certain the truth became. The mother's lips parted in a soundless gasp, her hand reaching out toward her son, as though touch might restore what sight had stolen. The father's jaw tightened, his body rigid, refusing to move. The brothers shifted further away, their unease sharpening into dread. Thomas himself did not understand. He leaned closer, tilting his head, searching desperately for some trace of himself in the polished surface. He pressed his hand to the mirror, and there, upon the glass, his palm left no mark. His breath fogged nothing. The candlelight revealed every detail of those around him, yet he remained an absence, an emptiness framed in wood and glass. The family did what so many families do in the face of the inexplicable, they prayed. The mother clutched her rosary and whispered trembling verses, her voice breaking on the words. The father ordered silence, demanding that no one speak of what they had seen. Yet his commands trembled with uncertainty, as though he too felt the weight of something unnatural pressing against them. Outside, the wind stirred, rattling the shutters of the house. The candle flickered violently, casting shadows that leapt across the walls like fleeing spirits. In that shifting light, Thomas seemed less a child than a ghost already half vanished from the world of the living. The mirror, still and implacable, offered no explanation. It reflected the family faithfully, cruelly, but refused Thomas. It was as though the boy had been erased from the very fabric of reality, not dead, not alive, but unseen, unacknowledged by the world's most ordinary witness. Fear spread quickly, though none wished to admit it aloud. The brothers shifted to the farthest corners of the room, whispering to each other in tones sharp with panic. One muttered that the boy was cursed, another that it was a punishment for sin. Their father struck the wall with his fist, demanding silence, insisting the mirror was flawed, broken, untrustworthy. Yet when he looked into it again, his fury drained into helplessness. For in its surface he saw himself, his wife, his older sons, and the same emptiness where Thomas should have been. The mother wept. Not the loud, violent sobs of grief, but a soft, continuous sound, as if her soul were unraveling stitch by stitch. She gathered Thomas against her, holding him close, as though to reassure herself that he still existed in flesh, if not in reflection. His small body trembled, not with tears, but with confusion, with the dawning terror of a child who realizes he is different in a way that cannot be explained. Finally, unable to bear the sight, she reached for the heavy cloth draped over the armchair and flung it across the mirror. The fabric fell like a shroud, covering the glass in instant darkness. The family stood together, listening to the muted silence that followed. It was as though something in the room had exhaled, a tension released only when the mirror was blind. But the silence did not bring comfort. It brought questions, unspoken yet pressing. What had they witnessed? Was the boy touched by illness, by sin, by forces they dared not name? Was it a trick of the eye, or something deeper, more terrible? The father muttered again that no word of this should leave the house, that their neighbors must never know. He swore it was nothing more than superstition, that a broken mirror had deceived them. But in his eyes, shadowed by the candle's dying light, the truth was clear. He did not believe himself. That night, the family went to their beds without speaking further, each retreating into their own silence. Yet none of them slept soundly. In every creak of the timbers, in every breath of wine through the eaves, they heard an echo of the mirror's refusal. And Thomas, lying awake in the narrow bed he shared with his brothers, stared into the darkness, wondering if perhaps he had been erased from the world in some way he could not yet understand. It was the beginning of a mystery that would consume the Whitcombs, the village of Greywick, and eventually, every soul who dared to peer too long into a mirror. For what they had seen that night was not merely the absence of a reflection. It was the presence of something far more unsettling, a silence in glass, a denial that no prayer, no hammer, no human hand could shatter. And so, in the quiet farmhouse on the edge of Greywick, history's first whisper of the mirrorless boy was born, an enigma that would haunt the family, the village, and, some say, anyone who dares to look too closely at their own reflection in the years that followed. To understand the terror that unfolded within the Whitcomb farmhouse, one must first step into the soil of Greywick itself. For a mystery does not exist in isolation, it grows from the ground it inhabits, shaped by the fears, beliefs, and silences of a community. Greywick was such a place, and its very nature seemed destined to cradle a story like this. Nestled between rolling hills and thick woodlands, Greywick was, in the middle of the 19th century, a village apart. Its fields yielded barley and oats, its lanes were narrow ribbons of earth, and its cottages leaned close together as though whispering secrets to one another. Travelers rarely lingered. To most, Greywick was merely another dot upon the map, a place where work was endless, life was hard, and the people clung to faith and tradition with a stubbornness born of necessity. The seasons ruled everything. Summers were brief, autumns heavy with harvest, winters long and cruel. By candlelight, families huddled together through the dark months, telling stories passed down from ancestors who had endured wars, famine, and plague. These tales were not mere diversions, they were survival tools, instructing the young to respect the unseen world, to fear what could not be explained. Every child in Greywick grew up with warnings whispered into their ears: do not whistle after dusk, do not walk alone into the woods, do not leave a mirror uncovered in a sick room. It was a village steeped in ritual. The church bell rang not only for worship but to ward off storms. Windows were crossed with sprigs of rowan in the spring, protecting against ill will. Even the placement of furniture carried meaning. Beds never faced mirrors, for fear that souls might be lured into them during sleep. These were not merely superstitions, they were anchors for a people who lived with hardship as constant as the changing weather. The Whitcomb family belonged firmly to this world. Jonathan Whitcomb, the father, was a man of broad shoulders and hard lines, the kind who believed sweat and discipline could cure most ills. His faith was strong, though it was a faith rooted less in mystery than in duty. His wife, Margaret, softer of manner but equally firm of spirit, was the quiet heart of the household, stitching clothes by firelight, kneading bread at dawn, whispering prayers when the children slept. They had 3 sons before Thomas, and each boy was raised in the same rhythm: rise with the sun, labor in the fields, break bread in silence, sleep when the work was done. Greywick's life left little room for indulgence. Childhood was short, adulthood inevitable. And yet, within this strict rhythm, the Whitcombs were respected. They were known as upright, dependable, and steadfast, a family bound by faith and by the soil itself. When Thomas was born, neighbors said he came into the world too quiet. Unlike his brothers, who had wailed with fierce lungs, Thomas emerged into life with only a soft, uncertain cry. His eyes, wide and solemn, seemed to watch the world rather than demand from it. Some whispered that such a birth foretold weakness, others that it marked him as blessed. In Greywick, both interpretations carried weight. From the start, Thomas was different. While his brothers wrestled and chased each other through the fields, he lingered by the pond, gazing into the still water for hours. He seemed entranced by silence, content to sit apart while the world unfolded around him. His mother, indulgent at first, called him her little dreamer. His father frowned, fearing softness in a boy who would one day be expected to shoulder the same burdens as his brothers. Yet difference, in a village like Greywick, was dangerous. Where hardship pressed upon every household, deviation from the norm could invite suspicion. A child who laughed at the wrong hour, who stared too long into shadows, who resisted the ordinary rhythm of life, such a child became a subject of whispers. And whispers in Greywick were the first step toward isolation. The village itself was small enough that nothing remained private for long. The Whitcombs' lives were observed as closely as the weather. If the eldest son stumbled in church, the congregation remembered. If Margaret's bread failed to rise, neighbors wondered if her faith had faltered. And when, in time, small peculiarities began to surround Thomas, the village eyes were sharp, their memories sharper still. It was into this setting that the mirror incident erupted, and it is here that its power grew. For Greywick was not London, where skepticism flourished among scholars. Nor was it some nameless hamlet forgotten by time. It was a village balanced precariously between the rational and the mystical, between scripture and superstition. Its people believed both in the healing words of the vicar and the unseen hand of curses. In such a place, a boy who cast no reflection was not merely an oddity. He was a crack in the fragile wall that held their world together. The Whitcombs, of course, tried to maintain appearances. They carried on with their farm work, attended church without fail, and offered smiles at the marketplace. But beneath the surface, unease brewed. Margaret's glances grew more anxious. Jonathan's prayers grew louder, as though defiance itself might shield his family. And Thomas, the quiet child who once gazed into water as though searching for answers, now looked away, unable to meet his own absent reflection in any surface. In Greywick, the land remembered. Every family carried stories of strangeness, an ancestor who walked in dreams, a cow that calved under a blood moon, a neighbor who wasted away under a curse none dared name. The tale of Thomas Whitcomb would not be the first whispered into the soil of the village, nor would it be the last. But unlike most, his story carried with it the weight of mirrors, of absence, and of silence that could not be explained. This was Greywick, devout yet fearful, hardworking yet fragile, bound by faith yet haunted by superstition. And it was within these narrow lanes, these candlelit cottages, and these whispered tales that the legend of the mirrorless boy began to take root, destined to grow into one of the darkest mysteries the village would ever carry. Every haunting begins not with thunder but with a whisper. For the Whitcombs, the first true sign that something was wrong with their youngest son did not arrive in a blaze of spectacle, but in the stillness of water. It was late spring, the pond behind the farmhouse swollen with rain. The older boys skimmed stones across its surface, their laughter echoing through the damp air. Margaret watched from the bank, her hands busy with mending. Thomas, younger and quieter, stood at the edge, peering down at the water. The surface rippled with breeze, reflecting clouds, reeds, and the faces of his brothers. Yet when Margaret's eyes settled on the water where Thomas stood, her stitching fell from her lap. There was no reflection of her youngest son. She blinked, convinced she had misseen. Perhaps the water had shifted, perhaps the light had broken at an odd angle. She rose, stepping closer. Again she looked. The pond gave back the images of reeds bending in the wind, of dragonflies hovering, of two laughing boys bending over the water's edge. But Thomas was absent, his figure erased. He crouched to dip his hand into the shallows, and though she could see the ripples form, the water showed no sign of his movement. Margaret did not cry out. Instead she forced a smile and called the children in for supper. But that evening, when the others had gone to bed, she whispered to her husband what she had seen. Jonathan scowled, dismissing it as a trick of light. He told her she was tired, that the mind can play cruel tricks when burdened with care. And though she wanted to believe him, unease rooted itself in her heart. The anomalies grew. At first they were small, easy to overlook. A polished kettle that failed to show Thomas's face. A window pane in which his brother's images appeared, but his stood absent. Margaret began to test the glass in secret. She would lift Thomas in her arms and face the mirror in their bedroom. Always, the same result, her own pale face returned, but her son's form dissolved into nothingness. Sometimes she would shake the mirror, hoping the flaw would right itself. But it never did. She told no one else. In Greywick, such matters were dangerous to speak aloud. The village thrived on gossip, and suspicion once seated could never be erased. Still, silence could not keep the truth from bleeding into daily life. The Whitcomb livestock, once docile, grew restless whenever Thomas approached. Cows shied in their stalls. Horses stamped their hooves. Even the family dog slunk from the boy's touch. Margaret tried to explain it away, perhaps the animal sensed a weakness, perhaps Thomas carried a strange scent. Yet she, too, had begun to flinch at times when his face caught hers in dim light, the boy's presence too real and yet somehow absent. There were other moments, small, uncanny, but impossible to ignore. A shelf of glassware shuddering and falling the instant Thomas walked beneath it. A portrait of the Whitcomb family, taken by a traveling photographer, that revealed every detail of father, mother, and older sons, while Thomas's outline was blurred, as though the camera's lens had refused to capture him. The photographer, unsettled, claimed the plate had been damaged and refused to retake the picture. Jonathan smashed the photograph in anger, but the shards of glass, once more, reflected nothing of his youngest boy. Word began to stir despite their efforts. Children at play claimed Thomas made no image in the rain puddles after a storm. One child swore he could walk beside him and see only himself mirrored in the water. Margaret hushed the talk when it reached her ears, but whispers travel fast in a village like Greywick. Soon, mothers pulled their children back from Thomas when he passed in the lane. Some muttered of omens. Others, of curses. Thomas himself noticed. He was no fool. At first, he did not understand why his brothers laughed at their reflections and he did not join them. Why his mother's smile faltered when she brushed his hair before a covered mirror. He began to test the world himself. At the pond, he crouched and stared long into the surface. He waved his arms, watching the water stir without showing him there. He pressed his face close to the window panes at dusk, searching for the faintest outline. The absence gnawed at him. He grew quieter, pulling into himself, as though retreating from a truth too heavy for his young heart to bear. By the time the Whitcombs gathered before the mirror that winter night, Margaret had already known in her soul what they would see. She had been living with the first anomaly for years, trying to hide it beneath silence and prayer. But in Greywick, no secret could remain hidden forever. The strange absence of Thomas was no longer confined to a pond or a kettle. It was growing, creeping into the very walls of the house, pressing at the edges of what the family could deny. The first anomaly had been subtle. But like the crack in a wall that widens with each season, it had opened the way to something larger, something that would come to consume not only the Whitcombs but the entire village around them. In a village as small and close as Greywick, secrets had no walls. A rumor could pass from one cottage to another as swiftly as smoke on the wind. And so, the truth about Thomas Whitcomb's absence in mirrors and water could not remain hidden for long. By the time winter yielded to spring, the story had slipped into the lanes and hearths of Greywick, reshaping the way neighbors looked at the boy and at the family who tried to protect him. It began with the children. They were the first to speak openly, for children's tongues were unguarded, their games merciless. After a rainfall, when puddles filled the ruts of the dirt road, the children of Greywick would lean over the water, giggling at their own reflected faces. But when Thomas crouched beside them, the laughter would break into uneasy silence. The water gave back only the shapes of the others. Where he crouched, there was nothing. A gap, an absence. And children notice absence with an honesty adults fear. "Why don't you have a face?" one girl asked him, her tone neither cruel nor kind, merely curious. Thomas had no answer. He turned away, cheeks burning, wishing more than anything that the water would give him the proof he longed for. But the silence of the puddles spoke louder than words. Soon, the children refused to play with him at all. They scattered when he approached, muttering of ghosts and changelings. One even swore he had seen Thomas's shadow stretch too far across the ground, as though it belonged to something else entirely. The whispers spread upward, from children to mothers, from mothers to fathers, until they reached the entire parish. In Greywick, whispers did not remain whispers for long. They became judgments. And judgments, once cast, were almost impossible to reverse. Some claimed Thomas was not truly Margaret's child, that he had been swapped at birth by spirits from the wood. Others whispered it was a punishment from God, a mark upon the Whitcombs for sins unspoken. The most superstitious muttered that the boy was a hollow thing, born without a soul. For how else could a child fail to cast a reflection? The village vicar, Reverend Alden, stood against such talk in his sermons. He warned against superstition, declaring that fear was the devil's tool, and that a Christian village must not descend into pagan mutterings. Yet even Alden, when pressed, could not hide his discomfort. Parishioners noticed he had grown hesitant to meet the boy's gaze. And once, when Thomas lingered near the church font after service, Alden hurried away without a word, his hands trembling as though in silent prayer. The Whitcomb household became a place of strained silence. Margaret tried to comfort her youngest son, but her words were hollow. She urged him to keep close to the family, to avoid the village lanes where children taunted him, to ignore the words carried by the wind. But Thomas could feel the shift in her tone, could see the tension in her eyes when she brushed the hair from his forehead and looked anywhere but toward the covered mirror on the wall. His brothers grew restless. Once, they had played together as boys do, with fists and laughter and shouts in the fields. But now they kept their distance, sleeping with their backs to him in the narrow bed they shared. At supper, they avoided meeting his eyes. One of them muttered a prayer under his breath whenever Thomas entered the room. When Jonathan, the father, heard it, he struck the boy across the mouth and ordered silence. Yet the fear lingered, unspoken but ever present. Jonathan himself clung to denial with iron fists. He smashed the remaining mirrors in the house, swearing that if the glass would not reflect his son, then it would reflect no one. He forbade Margaret to speak of the matter, and when neighbors dared to question, he met them with stony silence or explosive rage. To him, admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that his son was not like other boys, and that was something his pride could not bear. But rage could not silence the village. Greywick had long memories and sharper tongues. By lantern light, neighbors spoke of the Whitcombs as cursed. A farmer claimed his crops had failed after Thomas passed his field. A milkmaid swore her cow gave blood instead of milk when the boy brushed its flank. Each tale grew more fantastical as it spread, feeding the collective unease. By summer, Thomas was no longer just a peculiar child in Greywick. He was a threat, a warning, a living symbol of something the village did not understand. And so, the boy himself began to change. Once merely quiet, he grew withdrawn, haunted by the way people's eyes lingered on him. He no longer lingered by the pond. He no longer asked to join the children in their games. Instead, he walked alone through the fields, shoulders bent, head lowered, as though bracing himself against a storm only he could feel. At night, he whispered to his mother that he wished he could see himself, that he wished he could prove he was real. But even she, clutching him close, had no answer. The whispers in Greywick had taken root, and once planted, they would not die. They wrapped themselves around the Whitcomb family like ivy around stone, suffocating and unrelenting. And each passing day, the boy without a reflection grew not only into a child of silence but into a story told in shadows. A story the village itself would never forget. Every family faced with the unexplainable chooses a path. Some turn to faith. Some to fear. But Jonathan Whitcomb, patriarch of the Whitcomb household, chose denial. For a man who had lived his entire life by the sweat of his brow and the steadiness of his hand, the thought that something supernatural had touched his home was intolerable. If he admitted it, he would surrender everything he believed about order, labor, and reason. And so he did not admit it. He raged instead. Jonathan was known in Greywick as a hard man, not cruel but unbending. His neighbors respected his discipline, his fields plowed straight as scripture lines, his word rarely questioned. But within his own household, his temper was a weight carried by all. Margaret knew the look in his eyes when anger burned hotter than reason. The children knew the sound of his boots pacing when his pride was wounded. And Thomas, most of all, learned that his father's silence was heavier than his voice. After the first whispers began to spread through Greywick, Jonathan declared that mirrors were liars. He gathered the ones remaining in the house, an oval glass from the parlor, a square hand mirror kept in Margaret's drawer, even a fragment salvaged from the barn, and carried them into the yard. There, with the sun high above, he smashed them to pieces with a hammer. The sound echoed across the fields, shards scattering like ice upon the grass. "No mirror will judge my son," he told the family, his voice low, dangerous. "No glass will make a fool of us." Margaret watched from the kitchen doorway, Thomas pressed close to her skirts. She said nothing, though her heart quivered. She had prayed that the mirrors might one day relent, might reveal the boy's reflection if only they waited. Now those hopes lay shattered in the dirt, broken into fragments too sharp to touch. But Jonathan's denial did not bring peace. It brought silence, a silence so heavy it pressed upon the children like a second skin. They no longer spoke of Thomas's absence, not at the table, not in the fields, not even in whispered conversations before sleep. The older boys obeyed their father, burying their unease beneath stoicism. Yet their glances betrayed them, flickers of fear when Thomas passed too close. Jonathan saw those glances but pretended not to. He would not permit weakness. He would not allow his family to crumble beneath superstition. His efforts grew more violent. When Margaret was caught humming prayers beneath her breath as she brushed Thomas's hair, Jonathan slammed his fist upon the table, declaring that she was feeding the village's madness. "He is flesh and blood," Jonathan growled. "He is my son. And I will hear no talk of curses." Yet beneath his anger lay fear. At night, when he thought himself unobserved, Jonathan would sit alone at the kitchen table, staring into a shard of broken glass he had kept from the yard. He would hold it at different angles, tilting it to catch the lamplight. The shard showed his weathered face, lined with exhaustion, but when Thomas once wandered in, curious, Jonathan shoved the piece into his pocket before the boy could lean near. Margaret noticed, but she said nothing. She knew then that her husband's denial was not conviction. It was desperation. The farmhouse itself began to echo that desperation. Windows stayed covered, cloth hung over any surface that might reflect. Even the pots were kept dull, their shine scrubbed away by Margaret's weary hands. Visitors remarked that the house seemed dimmer than it once had, its air heavy, its corners shadowed. Few lingered. Even fewer returned. For Jonathan, this suited him well. Isolation was easier than facing questions. He refused to attend gatherings in the village. He ignored the wary stares of neighbors at church. When the vicar visited to inquire after the family, Jonathan met him at the door and blocked the way inside. "We want no charity, no pity," he said flatly. The vicar left with unease written on his face, but Jonathan did not care. The fewer who saw Thomas, the fewer who could spread poison with their words. But isolation did not erase the truth. Within the Whitcomb home, Thomas continued to grow into silence. He followed his father in the fields, working the soil, carrying tools, obeying every order. And yet, when Jonathan wiped the sweat from his brow and looked at the shadow of his son beside him, he always felt something missing. The boy's presence was weightless, as if labor could never root him fully to the earth. The older brothers noticed too. Once, one of them dared to ask Jonathan why Thomas's shadow sometimes seemed faint at dusk. Jonathan struck the boy before the question could finish. No more was said. The family learned that silence was survival. In time, even Margaret's gentle defiance waned. The cloths remained over the mirrors. Her prayers became internal, whispered only when she believed no one could hear. She clung to her youngest son, stroking his hair at night, kissing his forehead, telling him he was loved. But in her eyes lingered the fear that Jonathan could not banish. She loved Thomas, but she could not deny what she had seen. She lived in the space between her husband's rage and the world's whispers. Jonathan's denial was not merely a shield against the village, it was a shield against himself. For deep in the marrow of his bones, he knew that something was wrong. He knew the boy he had raised as his son walked differently in the world, as though he carried some invisible barrier between himself and reality. Jonathan could not name it, and so he forbade anyone else to try. But denial is brittle. It holds strong until the weight becomes too much. In the Whitcomb home, the weight was growing. Each day that passed, each silence endured, each shard of broken glass hidden away, these were cracks in Jonathan's wall of defiance. And one day, inevitably, the wall would give way. The Whitcomb farmhouse had grown darker, not merely from the absence of mirrors, but from something far less tangible, something that pressed itself into every corner of the house. Shadows lingered longer than they should. Even in the daylight, when the sun fell in golden stripes across the floorboards, there were places that never seemed fully lit. It was as if the world itself recoiled from Thomas. At first, Margaret thought she was imagining it. A mother's nerves, sharpened by fear. But one morning, while sweeping the kitchen floor, she noticed Thomas standing in the doorway. The sunlight fell across his feet, but his shadow stretched in the wrong direction, bending toward the darker wall instead of aligning with the others. She blinked, and it seemed to right itself. She told herself it had been a trick of the light. Yet in her heart, she knew she had not been mistaken. The older brothers began to notice strange changes too. Daniel, the second eldest, whispered to Samuel that Thomas's shadow sometimes appeared thinner, stretched, as though he were taller than he truly was. Once, while repairing a fence, Daniel swore he saw Thomas's shadow working beside him even though the boy was several yards away. The brothers did not speak of it to their father, for Jonathan's fury had become legendary. But the silence gnawed at them all. Greywick, though distant from the farmhouse, was not blind. Children in the village began to mutter that Thomas was cursed. They claimed he moved without a proper shadow, or that his reflection was visible only to those marked for death. Such tales, once begun, traveled swiftly. Women at the market spoke in hushed tones, drawing crosses upon their chests when Margaret approached. Neighbors who once waved now turned their eyes away. Isolation was no longer a choice, it had become a verdict handed down by the village. The air inside the farmhouse thickened with dread. Nights were the worst. Thomas would wake crying, his voice thin and trembling. When Margaret came to his side, she found him pointing toward the corner of the room, whispering of a figure that stood there. Yet when she lit the candle, the corner was empty. She told him it was only a dream. But when she left, she could not rid herself of the sensation that something had followed her into the hall. Jonathan's denial grew harsher as the shadows deepened. He worked the family harder, demanding longer hours in the fields. Sweat, he believed, would burn away fear. But even he could not entirely blind himself. One evening, as the family gathered for supper, the candlelight cast their forms against the wall. All 5 figures appeared in solid shape, except Thomas. His shadow wavered, fluttering like smoke, sometimes dissolving entirely before reappearing again. Jonathan saw it. The children saw it. Margaret saw it. But no one dared to speak. Only the sound of Jonathan's fork scraping his plate broke the silence. The psychological weight of this unspoken terror pressed heavily upon them all. Margaret grew pale, her health fraying as sleepless nights took their toll. The older brothers withdrew, speaking less, keeping their eyes low. Even the animals seemed unsettled. The family dog, once loyal to Thomas, began to avoid him, growling low whenever the boy entered a room. The horses shied away when Thomas approached the barn, their eyes rolling white. Margaret's prayers became desperate, whispered beneath her breath at dawn and dusk. She begged for deliverance, for explanation, for any sign that her son was not lost to something unholy. But heaven remained silent. Only the shadows answered, and their answers were wordless. The villagers, too, began to act. Rumors reached Jonathan that some spoke of exorcism, others of banishment. Though no one confronted him directly, the weight of their suspicion was clear. When he brought produce to market, customers handled his goods reluctantly, as though fearing contamination. When Margaret tried to sell preserves, jars remained untouched upon the stall. The Whitcombs were marked, not with a scar or brand, but with whispers that clung like smoke. Jonathan responded with anger. He barred the children from entering Greywick, forbade Margaret from speaking to neighbors. He closed the world around his family like a clenched fist. But isolation could not protect them from themselves. Inside the farmhouse, the shadows continued their dance, lengthening, bending, slipping free of the boy they belonged to. Thomas himself seemed both aware and unaware. At times, he stared at his own shadow as though it were a stranger. He followed its movements with wide, confused eyes. Once, he told his mother that the shadow whispered to him, though he could not remember the words upon waking. Margaret held him close, her tears wetting his hair, but her comfort rang hollow. The breaking point came one night when a storm rattled the valley. Thunder shook the walls, lightning split the sky. The children huddled in their beds, restless and afraid. When Margaret entered Thomas's room to check on him, she froze. The lightning revealed his shadow stretched across the wall, not merely longer, but wrong. Its head twisted at an angle his own did not, its arms clawing where his hands merely rested. She gasped, dropping the candle. The flame sputtered out. In the darkness that followed, she thought she heard movement not belonging to her son. She told Jonathan the next morning. For the first time, his fury did not come. He only looked at her with hollow eyes, silent, as though some part of him had finally broken. Denial had carried him far, but the weight was undeniable now. Something unnatural had taken root in his home, and no strength of will could smash it into fragments like glass. The Whitcombs, once proud and steady, stood at the edge of something vast and unknowable. Their isolation was no longer a shield. It was a prison. And the shadows within that prison were growing stronger. In times of fear, even the strongest faith falters. Greywick, though small and isolated, was not cut off entirely from the wider world. Stories of strange happenings, of illnesses of the mind and spirit, occasionally reached the town through traveling merchants or passing preachers. And in the months following the Whitcomb family's misfortune, curiosity replaced avoidance in a handful of outsiders. They arrived not as neighbors but as men of learning, each with their own explanations for what was consuming the youngest boy. The first came in the form of Reverend Elias Carter, a wiry man from a nearby parish whose sermons were laced with fire and brimstone. Word of the Whitcomb curse had reached his ears, and he saw in it a battle between heaven and hell. He stood in the Whitcomb farmhouse, Bible in one hand, cross in the other, and declared that Thomas had become a vessel for wickedness. He recited prayers of deliverance, his voice sharp as a blade. Thomas trembled, his eyes wet with confusion, while Margaret clutched him protectively. The Reverend's prayers echoed against the beams, yet when he finished, Thomas's shadow only writhed more violently in the candlelight. Carter left with a grim warning: if the family did not purge the evil, the entire valley might fall beneath its sway. Jonathan scoffed at the Reverend's threats, yet his pride was a fragile thing. He longed for answers beyond the narrow cage of superstition. When a traveling physician named Dr. Nathaniel Heron came through Greywick, Jonathan seized upon the chance for reason. Heron was a man of science, or so he claimed, educated in the cities where gas lamps lit the streets and libraries overflowed with knowledge. He examined Thomas with a careful hand, inspecting his eyes, listening to his heart, questioning him with clinical detachment. To Margaret, Heron spoke of imagination, of the curious ways in which the mind of a child could warp perception. The boy's terror of mirrors, his strange shadow, his trembling fits at night, these were symptoms of hysteria, nothing more. A mind ill at ease could trick the senses. He prescribed tonics of valerian and laudanum, insisting that rest and proper regimen would restore Thomas. For a time, Margaret clung to these words as if they were scripture. She fed her son bitter draughts and prayed that reason might succeed where faith had failed. But the shadows did not relent. If anything, they grew bolder. Under Heron's watchful gaze, Thomas's reflection still refused the glass. His shadow still twisted unnaturally. When confronted with the contradiction, Heron's confidence faltered. He muttered of unknown conditions, of nervous maladies not yet named. He left the farmhouse with his satchel heavier in coin but lighter in certainty. Other men came in Heron's wake. A folklorist from the city, drawn by rumor, spoke of ancient tales wherein children were born without reflections, marked as changelings or stolen souls. He recorded the Whitcomb story in meticulous handwriting, though he offered no cure, only the weight of myth. Another traveler, a scholar dabbling in the new sciences of magnetism and electricity, declared that unseen energies were at work, distorting light and shadow. He carried with him peculiar instruments of brass and wire, setting them on tables as if the secrets of the house could be drawn out like iron to a lodestone. Yet his machines flickered uselessly, and he departed muttering of mysteries unsuited to common minds. Each explanation offered hope, yet each failed in turn. And with every failure, the Whitcombs sank deeper into despair. Margaret began to feel as though Thomas were an experiment, prodded and examined by men more eager for discovery than salvation. She longed for someone to see her son not as a puzzle, but as a boy, frightened, fragile, fading before her very eyes. The villagers, meanwhile, watched from afar. They saw the comings and goings of strangers as proof that something unnatural lurked within the farmhouse. Whispers multiplied. Some claimed that learned men sought to harness Thomas's curse for their own gain, that knowledge itself was corrupted by the boy's condition. Superstition and skepticism braided together until no one could tell where reason ended and fear began. Inside the farmhouse, tension grew unbearable. Jonathan clung stubbornly to the words of Heron, repeating them as a shield against the unknown. "It is hysteria. It is the mind," he said, as though the mantra might banish the shadows. But the evidence betrayed him. Margaret's faith crumbled under the weight of contradictions. She prayed less and watched more, her eyes hollow, her lips pressed tight. The older brothers remained silent, their childhood stolen by the sight of things no child should witness. Thomas himself grew weary. Once playful, he now sat in long silences, his gaze fixed on walls as though listening to whispers no one else could hear. When Margaret asked him what he saw, he answered only in fragments, "It wants me. It stands behind. It does not sleep." Each word cut her deeper, until she began to fear that even her son's voice was being taken from her. The learned men had come and gone, but the house was no closer to peace. Their theories clashed, faith, science, folklore, energy, yet none aligned with the dreadful reality that the Whitcombs lived each day. In the silence after their departure, the shadows seemed to mock the family, stretching longer, darker, as if feeding on the failure of every explanation. And so the Whitcombs found themselves caught between worlds, between the pulpit and the laboratory, between folklore and philosophy. None offered refuge. None diminished the terror. The family was left alone once more, isolated not just by Greywick's suspicion but by the insufficiency of every so-called cure. When the last of the scholars departed, Margaret closed the door with trembling hands. She leaned her forehead against the wood, tears streaming silently. Thomas stood behind her, watching. His shadow, long and shivering, reached across the floor as if it longed to touch her, though his small body remained still. No priest, no physician, no scholar could explain why mirrors refused him, why shadows obeyed laws unknown. The Whitcombs were alone with their mystery. And with each passing day, that mystery grew heavier, darker, more suffocating. It was no longer merely a question of what afflicted Thomas. It was becoming a question of how much longer the family could endure. There comes a moment in every unraveling when the threads can no longer hold. For the Whitcomb family, that moment arrived in the winter of 1873, when the air itself seemed to crack beneath the weight of their suffering. Greywick's winters were long, its nights stretched endlessly, and in that darkness the farmhouse became less a shelter than a trap. The days had turned bitter. Frost clung stubbornly to the edges of the Whitcomb windows, and the hearth fire offered only a shallow warmth. Margaret moved about the house in silence, her face gaunt, her steps slow. Jonathan worked the land with a kind of mechanical desperation, as if labor could drown the dread that had seeped into every beam of wood around him. But no amount of work, no prayer, no draught of medicine had changed Thomas's condition. His reflection still refused him. His shadow still bent and writhed. The boy no longer played. His laughter, once a small blessing in the quiet of the farm, had vanished. He sat by the fire most evenings, knees drawn to his chest, his eyes distant. When Margaret stroked his hair, he leaned into her touch, but his voice carried a hollowness. He began speaking of dreams in which the mirror beckoned him, though he could not enter it. He whispered of shadows that grew teeth. When asked to explain, he shook his head as though the visions were too heavy to share. The older brothers, Elias and Robert, grew restless. They had once teased their youngest sibling, as brothers often do, but now they looked at him with unease. They muttered in corners, argued in low voices, and eyed the mirror with suspicion whenever their mother forced them to cover it. Fear had wormed its way into their marrow. Margaret tried to hold her family together, yet her strength waned. Nights found her kneeling by the bed, praying in whispers that cracked into sobs. She begged for Thomas's deliverance, for some sign that heaven still listened. Silence was her only answer. Each morning she rose with swollen eyes, her body weary but her heart unwilling to surrender. Still, the silence gnawed at her faith. The true breaking point began with a scream. It tore through the farmhouse in the dead of night, sharp and unnatural. Jonathan bolted from bed, lantern in hand, while Margaret rushed to Thomas's room. The boy was standing before the covered mirror, his fingers clutching the cloth that hid its glass. He was sobbing, eyes wide with terror, pointing at the veil as though something beneath it writhed. When Jonathan pulled the cloth free, the family saw nothing but the blank surface. Nothing, save for the absence that had always haunted them. Elias and Robert stood behind, their breath fogging in the cold, their fear plain. They swore they had seen movement, as though something behind the glass had shifted. Margaret clutched Thomas to her chest, whispering frantically while Jonathan replaced the cover with trembling hands. That night, none slept. The wind howled against the shutters, and the fire sputtered weakly. Shadows crawled along the walls, bending in unnatural ways that no flame should cast. Margaret watched them, her hands shaking as she clung to her son. When she finally closed her eyes, it was only because exhaustion forced her. In the days that followed, tension mounted to the breaking point. Jonathan snapped at Margaret, accusing her of encouraging superstition with her prayers and tears. Margaret, in turn, accused him of denial, of refusing to see what was killing their child. The arguments grew louder, the boys cowering in corners while their parents' voices thundered. The villagers, already suspicious, began to distance themselves completely. No one offered help. The Whitcombs became pariahs, their farmhouse avoided as though a sickness lingered within. Isolation pressed down on them like the snow that piled against their door. The second rupture came only a week later. Margaret awoke in the middle of the night to find Thomas's bed empty. Panic surged through her as she searched the house, lantern swinging wildly in her hand. She found him standing in the barn, barefoot in the frost, staring at the mirror shard Jonathan had discarded months earlier. Its cracked surface gleamed faintly in the lantern light, and though Thomas should not have been reflected at all, Margaret swore she saw a flicker, something not her son, but something wearing his shape. She snatched the shard away, cutting her palm in the process, and dragged Thomas back inside. He wept silently, whispering, "It wants me." Margaret pressed her bleeding hand to her chest, staring at her son as though she no longer recognized him. After that, the family began locking every reflective surface away, burying shards of glass in the frozen earth, covering water buckets so no still surface could betray them. But hiding the mirrors did not ease the torment. The shadows now seemed emboldened, lengthening even in the glow of day. At times they writhed when Thomas did not move, stretching across the walls in grotesque mimicry. Elias refused to sleep in the same room, insisting he heard whispers in the dark. Robert began stammering in his speech, fear tightening his tongue. Jonathan, who once sought reason, now muttered to himself in frustration, pacing the farmhouse as though trying to puzzle out an impossible equation. He drank heavily, the bitter tang of whiskey clinging to him even in the morning. Margaret feared he was slipping beyond her reach. The night of the final collapse came without warning. The storm outside was violent, wind screaming against the shutters, snow lashing in waves. Inside, the Whitcombs gathered around the hearth, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. Thomas sat nearest the flames, his shadow stretching impossibly tall behind him, bending against the ceiling beams. Then the lanterns flickered and died, leaving only the fire's glow. The shadow twisted suddenly, splitting into unnatural branches, and a low moan filled the room, not from Thomas's lips, but from the walls themselves. Elias screamed. Robert fled to a corner. Jonathan cursed and hurled the poker into the fire, as though iron might banish the thing. Margaret clutched Thomas, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. The farmhouse shuddered as though struck by a great hand. Dishes rattled. Frost crept across the inside of the windows. And in the silence that followed, the family realized something dreadful. Thomas was no longer sobbing. He was smiling faintly, his eyes glassy, as though watching something none of them could see. It was in that smile, that unearthly calm, that the Whitcombs knew, they had reached the breaking point. There was no turning back. Whatever had taken root in their home had claimed more than shadows. It had found its way into their son. After the storm, the Whitcomb farmhouse fell into a heavy, unnatural silence. It was not the silence of peace, nor of rest, but a silence that pressed upon the walls and floors, thick as dust, impossible to shake. Greywick seemed to hold its breath. No child dared approach the lane. No neighbor ventured near. Even the animals, normally restless after a winter gale, remained still, heads lowered, eyes wide and unblinking. Margaret moved through the house as though through a tomb. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally on the boards, and she could swear the shadows followed her, stretching and bending at angles that should have been impossible. Thomas no longer spoke of whispers or shadows. He sat by the hearth for hours, staring into the fire with an intensity that chilled her to the bone. The boy's face, pale and still, seemed almost carved, unchanging, as if the soul within him had grown quiet in the aftermath of whatever had occurred during the storm. Jonathan, once a man of relentless denial, now walked the rooms muttering to himself. He avoided the mirrors entirely, though they were few and well covered. His hands trembled when he attempted to perform the simplest tasks, as though the events of the storm had stripped him of confidence in his own perception. He no longer raised his voice at the children, yet his silence carried a weight heavier than any rage. He had been defeated, not by men, not by superstition, but by the inexplicable, by a reality that defied reason. The older brothers, Elias and Robert, refused to play, to speak, even to meet their mother's eyes. Fear had become a permanent fixture in the house, lodged in their ribs, settled in their bones. They moved quietly from room to room, careful not to disturb the fragile stillness. Margaret noticed their hands often lingered near their mouths, as if to stifle even the tiniest sound. Days passed in this eerie quiet. The pond behind the farmhouse froze completely, yet Thomas never approached it. The dogs remained near the hearth, their ears flicking at sounds no one else could hear. The wind blew across the fields in steady gusts, carrying faint, almost imperceptible whispers that faded the moment anyone strained to listen. Greywick itself seemed to recede from the Whitcombs, as though the village had decided to pretend the family no longer existed. Margaret found herself speaking less, afraid that even her voice might awaken something dormant in the boy or in the house. She kept him close, brushing his hair, pressing kisses to his forehead, whispering reminders that he was loved, that they were together. Thomas, however, remained still. His eyes, once bright and curious, now held a depth of knowledge, or of awareness, that unsettled her. It was the look of someone who had seen something too vast for his age, too strange for comprehension, and who could not explain it. Jonathan attempted to return to his work, though the fields yielded little. The frost had killed much of the winter grain, and the cattle grew lean under the heavy snow. He labored mechanically, dragging tools across the frozen earth, but the strength that had once been a source of pride now seemed hollow. Every glance toward Thomas reminded him of the boy's altered state, and every glance away seemed to summon the shadows to crawl farther across the house. Even at night, there was no relief. The wind carried sounds too faint to identify, a scrape across the floorboards, the faintest whisper from a corner, or perhaps from the boy himself. Thomas would sometimes wake, sitting upright in bed, staring at the darkened ceiling. Margaret would rise to him, and he would only look at her, wordless, eyes wide and luminous in the candlelight. She feared to speak, afraid that any sound might stir something that had been set loose during the storm. It was in this silence that Margaret began to notice subtle changes. Objects shifted slightly when no one was near. A chair might be angled differently in the morning, a book placed on the table in a position it had never held the night before. The animals reacted to Thomas in ways more pronounced than before. The family dog would retreat completely from him, and the cows would tremble if he entered the barn. It was as if the boy's presence carried an unseen weight, one that altered the world around him without touching it physically. Greywick, as distant observers, speculated quietly. Some villagers reported seeing lights in the farmhouse at night, though no windows appeared to glow. Others swore they could hear murmurs in the snow, though no voices were present. Yet none approached. Fear had become collective, a buffer between the Whitcombs and the rest of the valley. Even the vicar, Reverend Alden, visited only once, leaving hastily, muttering prayers under his breath and glancing uneasily at the house. Within the Whitcomb home, the silence grew heavier with each passing day. Margaret understood instinctively that this quiet was not mere absence of sound. It was a presence, a weight pressing into the very air, binding every heartbeat, every breath. She watched Thomas as he moved slowly through the rooms, his steps careful, almost ceremonial. His shadow, though no longer writhing as violently as during the storm, remained subtly distorted, a constant reminder of the rupture that had passed through their home. Margaret knew, deep in her heart, that this silence was both a blessing and a curse. It protected them from the chaos of the world outside but held them captive within the boundaries of their own fear. The Whitcombs had survived the storm, but only by surrendering to a reality they could neither explain nor resist. Even Jonathan, the man who had once wielded denial as a shield, now seemed to shrink into the shadow of events beyond comprehension. He no longer questioned what had happened. He only moved carefully, following routines mechanically, a man hollowed out by the collision of superstition, science, and the inexplicable. The family existed in a fragile equilibrium, each aware that the silence was temporary, that the world might intrude again in ways none could predict. In the quiet, Margaret whispered her own prayers, not for understanding, not for miracles, but for endurance. For the ability to survive what had begun in whispers and escalated to shadows. And Thomas, sitting quietly beside her, seemed to listen, as though he too had learned the lesson of the silence, that survival required stillness, patience, and the courage to endure the unseen. Even as the seasons shifted, the Whitcomb farmhouse remained a silent witness to the inexplicable. Winter melted into spring, bringing green shoots to the frozen earth, yet no growth seemed to reach the shadows that lingered inside the home. The Whitcombs lived quietly, mechanically, their daily routines bound to fear and the unspoken understanding that Thomas had been altered in ways none could reverse. Outside, the village resumed its life, though conversations hushed when the farmhouse was mentioned, and children avoided the lane with a peculiar vigilance. Margaret often found herself staring at Thomas, searching for traces of the boy she had known before the storm and the shadows overtook him. He moved differently now, fluid but careful, as if negotiating an invisible path between the ordinary and something far more sinister. His eyes carried a depth of perception that was unsettling, an awareness beyond his years. She wondered if he could see into another realm, one tethered to the strange distortions of light and shadow that had once seemed harmless but had revealed themselves as far more ominous. Jonathan, too, wrestled with questions he dared not voice. He had spent his life believing in work, reason, and the natural order of things. Now, every attempt to assert control failed. His pride, once as rigid as the oak trees surrounding the farmhouse, had softened into resignation. He no longer asked why. He no longer sought explanation. The man who had smashed mirrors and demanded obedience now only watched, silent, waiting for the next event that might defy reason entirely. The older brothers, Elias and Robert, remained withdrawn, haunted by the memory of their youngest sibling's altered state. They asked no questions aloud, though their eyes often followed Thomas, studying his movements, his reactions to light, to shadow, to sound. In quiet moments, they whispered to each other, speculating whether their brother's condition was permanent, whether he would ever be fully himself again, or whether the boy had become something altogether new, an echo of humanity wrapped in a veil of something older, darker, and unknowable. Scholars and clergy alike had long abandoned the attempt to explain the Whitcombs' plight. The stories that once drew curious minds no longer held appeal, the boy's shadowed existence resisted categorization. Science offered theories of light distortion, neurological anomalies, and psychological trauma, but none accounted for the mirror's refusal, the warped shadows, or the almost palpable presence that seemed to cling to Thomas. Faith offered comfort to the bereaved but provided no answers, only prayers and cautionary tales. The tension between reason and belief remained unresolved, leaving the family and the village suspended in uneasy uncertainty. Margaret often reflected on the earliest days, remembering the shards of broken glass and Jonathan's furious denial. She remembered Thomas's frightened eyes, the first time he had realized his reflection did not obey him. Could the boy have been born this way? Was the mirror's refusal a symptom of some preternatural curse, or merely a quirk of chance magnified by fear and superstition? She could not answer these questions, and neither could anyone else. Each hypothesis seemed to dissolve under scrutiny, leaving only the silent acknowledgement that some mysteries were meant to endure. The village of Greywick continued to observe the Whitcombs from a distance. Parents warned their children to avoid the lane, whispering stories of a boy who carried a shadow that obeyed no law. Elders debated the cause in hushed tones, some insisted it was divine punishment, others claimed it was a residual malice from an older, forgotten magic. Travelers occasionally passed through, curious yet apprehensive, but the stories they returned with were fragmentary, inconsistent, and often dismissed by those who had not witnessed the house themselves. Margaret feared that the more the village speculated, the deeper the isolation became. Outsiders brought words, but no understanding. Their curiosity was a reminder that the Whitcombs were marked, their suffering visible yet fundamentally unknowable to those who had not lived it. The farmhouse became a hermitage, a place removed from time and conventional experience. Shadows stretched through rooms and across floors, seemingly innocent to the casual eye, yet always there, always shifting, a quiet testament to the disruption that had entered the family's life so abruptly and irrevocably. At night, Thomas continued to sit near the hearth, eyes fixed on the flames. Sometimes he whispered questions aloud, though they were half-formed, fleeting thoughts that vanished before anyone could respond. Margaret and Jonathan listened silently, hearts heavy, each wondering whether the boy's mind had shifted to a dimension they could not access, a realm where shadows and reflections obeyed laws unlike those of the ordinary world. Even the older brothers, who had grown accustomed to fear and quiet observation, could not ignore the questions, though they dared not ask them openly. The legacy of the Whitcomb phenomenon became intertwined with the family's daily life. Mirrors were no longer brought into the house, surfaces that could reflect were concealed or dulled. Candles were carefully positioned to minimize distortion, and the family maintained routines that would limit any unforeseen interaction with shadows. Despite these precautions, the underlying tension never disappeared. Every step, every glance at Thomas's still figure, was a reminder that some forces were beyond comprehension. And so the Whitcombs learned to live with the unresolved. Questions remained, heavy as winter frost. Was Thomas still the same boy who had been born into their care? Would the shadows ever release him? Were they a product of the supernatural, of science misunderstood, or of human imagination stretched to its limits? Margaret often found herself staring into the fire, seeking solace in its flicker, though the flames offered no answers. The silence of the house, the quiet presence of shadows, and the boy's calm but otherworldly demeanor served as a constant reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved. In the end, the family's existence became a careful negotiation with uncertainty. Each member understood that the world had shifted in ways that could not be reconciled with knowledge, faith, or reason. The Whitcombs endured, quietly, through the seasons and the years, bound together by necessity and the unspoken understanding that Thomas's condition would remain a puzzle for all time. Outside, Greywick moved forward, carrying tales of a boy who defied reflection, yet even as the village's memory faded, the house held on to the questions. The shadows remained, persistent and patient, and the boy, once fully visible and familiar, continued to occupy a space between what was known and what could never be explained. The lingering questions, in their quiet persistence, became the final legacy of the event, a reminder that some truths are untouchable, some mysteries unresolvable, and that even the most ordinary life can be invaded by something extraordinary, something that refuses to bend to human understanding. The Whitcombs survived, but they survived within the shadow of what they could never fully comprehend. Years passed, and the Whitcomb farmhouse remained, steadfast and somber, a sentinel of memory and unease. Greywick had changed around it, fences had rotted, fields had shifted hands, and families moved in and out, yet the farmhouse endured, its timbers groaning under the weight of countless winters. The village, once curious, had long since grown wary, teaching its children to avoid the lane and whispering the story of Thomas Whitcomb only in cautious tones. The boy who had once refused to appear in mirrors had grown, though in ways few fully understood. Thomas himself moved with a strange grace, an awareness of presence and absence that seemed cultivated through years of cautious observation. He rarely spoke of the shadows, though his gaze betrayed an understanding that went far beyond words. The family had adapted around him, learning not to challenge his routines, not to draw attention to reflective surfaces, and to respect the quiet authority the boy seemed to wield over the unseen. His shadow, though less grotesque than in childhood, remained subtly distorted, stretching slightly, bending just enough to hint at a reality that existed beyond conventional sight. Margaret aged, her hands lined with the labor and worry of decades. She never ceased her vigilance, attending to Thomas with the careful tenderness of a mother who had learned to live alongside the extraordinary. Even in her later years, she kept mirrors covered, windows polished only for the sake of light, and candles placed with precision. Her prayers, once frantic, had become quiet, meditative, a ritual to maintain the fragile equilibrium of her household. She did not hope for explanations, she hoped only for endurance, for the family to remain intact under the weight of the incomprehensible. Jonathan, though slowed by age and hardship, retained a stoic presence. The fury that had once driven him to destruction had hardened into a quiet resilience. He rarely spoke, observing instead, accepting the anomalies of the farmhouse as part of the fabric of his life. Though he sometimes caught the fleeting movement of Thomas's shadow and felt the chill that accompanied it, he no longer attempted to reason it away. Experience had taught him that some truths could not be interrogated, only respected. The family's survival depended upon acknowledgement of limits, upon the acceptance of forces beyond mortal comprehension. Elias and Robert grew into adulthood under the same weight of uncertainty that had marked their childhood. They spoke cautiously, never challenging their brother, understanding instinctively the delicate balance their mother and father had cultivated. Each of them carried memories of fear, of nights spent watching shadows twist across walls, and of storms in which the house itself seemed to resist the natural order. Those memories shaped their lives, forming a quiet respect for the unseen and a persistent humility before forces they could neither name nor predict. Greywick, meanwhile, retained the story of the Whitcombs as a whispered legend. Outsiders who asked about the family were met with vague warnings, children were told to avoid the lane, and the house itself was treated with reverence tinged with dread. Travelers occasionally recorded fragments of the tale in diaries or letters, describing a boy who had no reflection, a shadow that moved independently, and a family who endured in isolation. These accounts were inconsistent, often contradictory, and yet each carried the kernel of truth. The Whitcombs' existence had been altered irrevocably, leaving a trace upon the collective memory of the village. The legacy of Thomas Whitcomb extended beyond the household. Scholars of folklore and the nascent sciences of the 19th century occasionally referenced him in studies of unexplained phenomena. They debated whether his condition was physical, psychological, supernatural, or some combination thereof. Their theories ranged from the plausible to the fantastical: rare congenital conditions, psychological trauma intensified by environmental factors, or the intervention of forces beyond human comprehension. None, however, could account for the persistence of his shadow's distortion or the boy's continued avoidance by reflective surfaces. Margaret often reflected on these debates quietly to herself. She cared little for the conjecture of distant scholars. What mattered was the lived reality of her family. She had witnessed the terror in Thomas's eyes, had felt the weight of the shadows pressing against walls and floors, and had endured the isolation that followed. Theories mattered little when confronted with the daily negotiation required to maintain a fragile peace. Survival, Margaret knew, was a legacy in itself, and it was one she had labored to pass down to her children. The house itself became a repository of the family's history and their unique burden. Furniture was placed precisely, mirrors were absent or covered, and rooms were lit to minimize distortions. Each detail, however mundane it might have seemed to an outsider, carried significance, a subtle measure to preserve the balance between the ordinary and the extraordinary. Even decades later, those who entered the farmhouse reported a sense of caution, a perception that the house itself contained knowledge and awareness beyond its architecture. It was as though the walls themselves remembered the disturbances that had once erupted within. Thomas lived largely in quiet observation, a boy who had become a man under the weight of mysteries most could never grasp. He rarely spoke of the shadows, and when he did, his words were cryptic, measured, as though revealing too much might destabilize the balance he had learned to maintain. His shadow continued to bend subtly, an enduring testament to forces that could not be reconciled with human expectation. Yet the boy, now grown, carried himself with the calm of one who had survived the extraordinary, one who had learned to navigate a world in which rules were sometimes suspended and reality remained pliable. In the end, the Whitcombs' story became one of endurance rather than resolution. The questions that had haunted the household for decades: why does Thomas have no reflection? Why does his shadow bend unnaturally? What force has claimed him so completely, remained unanswered. Yet the family persisted, quietly asserting life over fear, routine over chaos, and love over despair. Their survival, and the manner in which they adapted, became their unseen legacy, a demonstration of resilience in the face of the incomprehensible, a record of humanity enduring against the shadows. Outside, Greywick continued its daily life, carrying the story of Thomas Whitcomb in whispers and half-remembered tales. To the villagers, the family was a cautionary emblem of the inexplicable; to the Whitcombs themselves, it was the environment in which they had learned patience, observation, and endurance. Mirrors might still refuse, shadows might still twist, and the questions might remain unresolved, but the family's presence endured, a living testament to the unseen legacy of what had transpired in that modest farmhouse so many years ago. Thus, the Whitcombs existed quietly, bearing the imprint of the extraordinary in ordinary life, leaving behind a legacy that was felt more than understood, remembered more than explained, and observed more than interpreted. Their survival, in the shadow of unanswerable mysteries, became their final testament to the endurance of the human spirit when confronted with the incomprehensible.